Good morning from Chicago, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar, How Interfaith Coalitions Can Strategically Combat Hate. My name is Molly Horan, and I'm the coordinator of the Faces Against Hate campaign at the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. It is my great honor today to introduce Rajdeep Singh, Director of Law and Policy at the Sikh Coalition. Rajdeep joined the Sikh Coalition in December 2009 and serves as its Director of Law and Policy. He focuses on developing and promoting policy solutions for civil rights issues through an interdisciplinary combination of government affairs, media relations, and interfaith coalition building. In this capacity, he has substantively engaged with the U.S. Congress, White House, and several federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State. He's led successful efforts to pass equal employment opportunity legislation in Oregon and California, published articles in the Washington Post and New York Times, appeared on numerous television and radio programs, and delivered dozens of presentations at government agencies, law schools, and universities. Raj has a background in bank regulation and has authored significant articles for legal journals discussing employment fairness in the industry and ethnicity. He earned his law degree in 2006 at the College of William and Mary and received his undergraduate degree in philosophy in 2003 at the University of Miami. I came to locate Raj in seeking an expert advocate in hate crime with experience dealing with government and media. When I saw the petition sent to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee last year after the massacre in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, I knew I needed to meet the person behind it. I found Raj, and he immediately agreed to offer his guidance. Raj is graciously joining us this morning from Miami, and I can tell you after several calls, he is a treasure trove of knowledge. So please feel welcome to ask your questions after his presentation. Raj, how are you doing this morning?
Doing very well. Thanks so much, Molly. I want to begin by thanking you for your support, for inviting me to be a part of this webinar, and also to the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions for giving me this honor. I want to start by giving you all sort of a disclaimer. I am calling you from Miami, Florida. I'm actually visiting with my family here, and I'm sitting outside in a patio, and there's some ominous-looking clouds up ahead, and so if I get disconnected, not to worry, Molly's got my back, and we will proceed with the teleconference and the webinar. So with that, I'd like to take you to the first slide, if you are following along on the web with PowerPoints. I want to start with a discussion of the Oak Creek massacre on August 5th, 2012. As many of you recall, 6 worshippers were murdered and several more were injured at a Sikh Gurdwara, which is a house of worship, by a gunman with known ties to neo-Nazi groups. It was one of the most lethal attacks on an American place of worship since the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And I want to stop here and underscore these points. Much in the way that the attack on the 16th Street Baptist Church is remembered in American history as a rallying call and turning point for the American Civil Rights Movement, we collectively must never allow the Oak Creek massacre to slide into obscurity. As many of you know, in the post-9/11 environment, which has been marked by widespread bigotry, xenophobia, and civil rights deprivation, and in a society that seems to be growing increasingly violent, all of us have to decide how and to what extent the Oak Creek massacre will matter and be remembered. And the Sikh Coalition and some of our allies have been very intentional about making connections between what happened in Oak Creek and what happened at the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. It's important for this to be remembered not as sort of a random act of violence, but as hopefully a turning point for the better in the context of efforts which are ongoing to promote civil rights for all Americans. The next slide is a very, very brief overview of Sikh Americans. It's very important to understand that Sikhs have been in the United States for more than a century. Sikh migration to the United States began during the late 1800s, around the late 1890s. It slowed because of the restrictive immigration laws that were targeted at Asians, and it picked up again in 1965 after the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Sikh population today is estimated at about 500,000. The largest concentrations are in California and New York City, and Sikhs are pursuing diverse professions and walks of life. And it's important to remember that bias-based violence against Sikhs is not exclusively a post-9/11 phenomenon. There is no doubt that there's been a staggering increase in the incidence of violence and discrimination against Sikhs and other communities in the post-9/11 environment, but one of the first documented instances of violence targeted at Sikhs occurred in Bellingham, Washington in 1907. And if you're looking at the PowerPoints, that's a portrait of Sikhs in Bellingham, Washington in the very early part, probably the first decade of the 20th century. And as far back as 1907, Sikhs were subjected to bigotry, violence, discrimination, as were other immigrant communities from Asia and other minorities in this country. So the bottom line here is that many of the challenges that we're facing nowadays are challenges that we've faced before and overcome before. The next slide is an overview of some of the challenges that Sikhs have faced in the post-9/11 environment. To put things into perspective, in the first 3 months after the 9/11 attacks, the Sikh Coalition, which at that time was sort of a nascent civil rights organization, only a few days old after 9/11, at that point had documented over 300 incidents of violence and discrimination just in the first 3 months after 9/11. And when you consider that the Sikh population might be no more than 500,000, that's quite staggering. I mean, that is 300 incidents in the first 3 months is really, really kind of a crisis mode, suggestive of a crisis for any community. And that's what we faced in the aftermath of 9/11. Unfortunately, those challenges haven't abated. And in recent years, we've conducted surveys in the San Francisco Bay Area and New York City and have found that 38% of Sikhs have suffered verbal harassment in the San Francisco Bay Area. About 41% have suffered the same in New York City. Staggeringly, 10% have experienced physical assaults or property damage, vandalism, on account of their religion in the San Francisco Bay Area. About 9% have suffered assaults in New York City. 6% have experienced property damage, vandalism in New York City as well. Again, when you consider the small size of the Sikh population, about 500,000 in this country, when you're seeing 10% of people in a major city telling you that they've experienced hate crimes, it suggests that Sikhs are potentially hundreds of times more likely than their fellow Americans to experience hate crimes. And that is really sort of a grave situation and something that really calls out for redress and a resolution. And it's not just Sikh adults who are experiencing hate crimes and discrimination. Sikh children, unfortunately, are suffering staggering rates of bullying. According to the same Sikh Coalition surveys that we conducted in New York City and San Francisco, and also a 2011 report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which is a federal agency, between half and 3/4 of turbaned Sikh students experience bias-based bullying and harassment. So again, this is suggestive of a problem that is not episodic, but rather an epidemic, an endemic in the Sikh community, and it again calls out for a solution. Balbir Singh Sodhi, whose photograph you see there, was one of the first high-profile casualties of post-9/11 backlash. He was a Sikh entrepreneur in Mesa, Arizona, and he was shot and killed on September 15, 2001 by a bigot who was lashing out and who thought that he was targeting someone who was responsible for the terrorist attacks. And that was back in 2001, and as we saw last year in Oak Creek, the problem of hate crime and bigotry towards Sikhs and others just hasn't abated. It's a problem that is still with us and festering. On the next slide, I want to give you a sense of the scope of post-9/11 violence and discrimination more generally. It's not just Sikhs who are facing challenges in the post-9/11 environment. Members of the Arab, Muslim, and South Asian American communities have also faced violence and discrimination on account of their actual or perceived religion, nationality, ethnicity, and so forth. Between 2000 and 2001, for example, the FBI documented a 1,600% increase in reported hate crimes motivated by anti-Muslim bias. 1,600% increase. And although the level of reported hate crimes has sort of decreased since 9/11, it's still higher than that which was reported before 9/11. So we are still in a period marked by heightened bigotry towards Muslim Americans in this country. And to the extent that Muslim Americans are subjected to discrimination, members of other communities, including the Sikh American community, have to be concerned about discrimination. The Department of Justice, particularly the Civil Rights Division, has investigated over 800 incidents of bias-motivated violence against Arab, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian Americans since 9/11. And it's important to remember that bias manifests itself not only as hate crimes, but also as workplace discrimination, school bullying, and racial and religious profiling. And I want to give you a little bit of context about the problem of profiling in particular. These are not episodic concerns or challenges that happen on sort of a hit or miss basis. The Gallup polling agency in 2006 conducted a survey of the American public and found at that time, 2006, that almost 40%, it was about 39%, but almost 40% of respondents representing the American public said that they would favor laws requiring American Muslims to carry special ID cards naming them as Muslims. Now that is quite frightening and quite staggering. And why is it frightening? Well, we've been down this road before. As many of you know, during World War II, during the Second World War, thousands of patriotic Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps. And so again, we've been down this road before. We faced similar challenges before. And to the extent that the treatment of Japanese Americans at that time was abhorrent, there are echoes of that being heard now. And it's up to us to push back and ensure that members of the American public aren't supportive of draconian measures that would subject Muslim Americans to profiling, because then all of us would suffer. And it's important also to note that politicians and lawmakers have an important role to play in this dialogue. One of our partner organizations, South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, issued a report about 2-3 years back documenting public comments that were made by lawmakers and politicians in the United States which were xenophobic and which were designed to exploit anti-Muslim and more generally anti-immigrant sentiment. And it's quite staggering to see and quite disconcerting to see members of the United States Congress, who are governing us as we speak, making comments in support of, say, profiling of Muslims and sort of endorsements of xenophobic and anti-Muslim bigotry. So there is a larger context in which anti-Sikh violence occurs, and it is something which is of relevance not just to the Sikh community, but other communities as well. So on the next slide, what I want to do is give you a sense of what we did after the Oak Creek massacre. And the idea here is to share information in the hope that some of the lessons that we learned can be applied more generally to the work that all of you do on civil rights and social justice issues. And I'd be eager to have a more robust discussion during the Q&A. After the Oak Creek massacre, the immediate priority was providing relief to the families of those who were murdered and injured in the Gurdwara on August 5th. And those efforts are ongoing. There was a need to bring government resources to bear, and even as we speak, we are assisting some of the families who lost loved ones with immigration matters and so forth. So there are long-term community-specific needs that are still high priority. But it was also important at the same time to make sure that the incident was put into perspective and put into the public record at the federal level. Too often in this country, there are mass shootings and other hate crimes and so forth, which sort of slide into obscurity because there isn't sort of an organized effort to make sure that these incidents are not forgotten. And so it was very important for the Sikh Coalition to make sure that Oak Creek would never be forgotten, and that it would be perhaps the beginning of a dialogue about the need to address bias, bigotry, and violence in the United States. So within a matter of 2 weeks, we approached members of the United States Senate, who were members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we literally walked into their offices and, with the help of our partners at SALT and also the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, requested a hearing. And the offices were sympathetic, but indicated to us that because of scheduling constraints, there was no guarantee that a hearing would happen. So leaving nothing to chance, what we decided to do was rally support from sort of civil rights, organize support from the civil rights community and also the interfaith community. And I'm proud to say that in a matter of about a week, we were able to get more than 150 organizations to sign a petition letter, which we drafted, petitioning the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold a hearing on hate crimes and the threat of domestic extremism in the United States. And the list of organizations that signed the letter is really sort of encouraging and kind of inspiring. I mean, the breadth and depth of diversity and sort of expertise represented on that list is, I think, a positive signal to us that there's much more scope than what we're accustomed to for collaboration on social justice and civil rights issues. Signatories on that letter included organizations representing the Asian American community, African Americans, Arab Americans, Latino Americans, African Americans, women's rights groups, immigrants' rights groups, people with disabilities, gays, lesbians, transgendered individuals, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jews, atheists, agnostics, HIV/AIDS activists, and traditional sort of secular civil rights organizations like the NAACP. So the bottom line here was that there was strength in numbers, and I think it really made an impression on members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. They realized that what happened in Oak Creek was not an issue of relevance to just the Sikh community or perhaps the post-9/11 community, but to a broad array of organizations representing the interests of tens of millions of Americans in this country. And so that letter was really a source of pride, and I'm convinced that that was what ultimately persuaded the Senate to organize the hearing and go ahead with it in spite of scheduling constraints. The petition campaign in its own right generated media coverage, and anytime you have media coverage for a campaign, that tends to amplify the impact of whatever you're doing, and so that was certainly something that gave incentives to the Senate Judiciary Committee to organize a hearing and go ahead and do it. At the hearing itself, remarkably, over 400 members of many communities, including the Sikh community, attended. If any of you have been in Washington, D.C. or live in D.C., you know that if you go to Senate or in general congressional committee hearings, most of the time the hearing rooms aren't filled to capacity, and the people who are there are, generally speaking, paid to be there. I mean, they're policy wonks and so forth. But here we had standing room only crowds of people who were interested and who had a stake in this hearing. And I believe that the Senate had to organize an overflow room, and that sort of gives you a sense of the level of public interest that was generated by the hearing. Also, I'm proud to say that over 80 organizations submitted written statements for the written record in connection with the hearing. To put things into perspective, this is more organizations weighing in on this issue than the number of organizations that submitted testimony in connection with the Matthew Shepard Hate Crime Prevention Act in 2009. So this hearing represented a continuation of the conversation about the need to address hate crimes in this country, but at the same time, it elicited more participation from more organizations than ever before. And so that's a very positive sign. On the next slide, I want to give you a sense of some of the issues that were addressed at the hearing. I gave you already a sense of the diversity that was represented in the letter that was sent to the Senate asking for the hearing. But there were other issues addressed beyond the ones that I've listed here, but generally speaking, there was a lot of interest in addressing gaps in federal hate crime statistics, including underreporting and the failure of the FBI to track hate crimes against Sikhs, Hindus, and Arab Americans. As many of you know, there is a campaign underway, which the Sikh Coalition has been driving for a couple of years now, to persuade the FBI to begin tracking hate crimes against Sikhs and other communities that have been targeted repeatedly by bigots for hate crimes. And as many of you know, the FBI is required by law to collect statistics on hate crimes in this country. They've been doing so since the early 90s. But unfortunately, they don't have any mechanism currently to track hate crimes against Sikhs, Hindus, and Arab Americans, all of whom have experienced hate crimes consistently over the course of the last decade or two. The campaign has generated an enormous amount of interest in the U.S. Congress, and as we speak, there's a letter being circulated by members of the House of Representatives, which I believe as of last week had been endorsed by about 100 members of the House, calling on the FBI to begin tracking hate crimes against these communities. The U.S. Senate about 2 weeks ago issued a letter that was endorsed by, I believe, 26 senators calling for the same. So this was an issue that was flagged at the hearing, and I'm happy to say that because of the testimony that was given at the hearing, because of some of the input that was provided by organizations in their written testimony, we now have the potential to change public policy with respect to the collection of hate crime statistics in this country. And it's a very important issue because without data, it's very difficult to address any problem. I mean, that's public policy 101. And our hope is that when a decision is made in June 2013, we will now have finally some official statistics about the magnitude of hate crimes against Sikhs, Hindus, and Arab Americans, and hopefully be able to bring diagnostic and deterrence efforts to bear once we have official data. In addition to the question of hate crime statistics, there was a lot of testimony and attention given at the hearing to the inadequacy of government scrutiny over domestic extremist groups. As many of you know, in the last couple of years, particularly in 2011, there were a whole series of hearings in the House of Representatives aimed at scrutinizing the American Muslim community. And those hearings were purportedly designed to uncover the extent to which there was radicalization and extremism in the American Muslim community. But many civil rights and advocacy organizations critiqued the House of Representatives at the time, particularly the Committee on Homeland Security, for not taking a more holistic view of domestic extremism. And I think the critique was well-founded because, as it turns out, most terrorist attacks in the United States in the last 3 decades, according to FBI data anyway, have been committed by domestic non-Muslim extremists. So it seemed to us that there was not a very nuanced and holistic approach to the issue of extremism in the U.S. Congress anyway. And one of the issues that we prioritized at the hearing in September after Oak Creek was the need to scrutinize domestic extremist groups with the same level of vigor that we scrutinized, say, Al-Qaeda. And in fact, as we learned after the Oak Creek shooting, the assailant was someone who was tied to neo-Nazi groups. So I invite you all, by the way, to watch the hearing if you haven't done so already. It's available on C-SPAN. There's a lot of good information there about the status of the government's response to domestic extremism and the growth of organizations devoted to extremist ideologies in this country. The last issue that we addressed, which is something that I alluded to before, was xenophobic rhetoric and other sort of obnoxious rhetoric by politicians and lawmakers in this country, and the absence of accountability. The idea here being that, you know, members of Congress, other politicians, lawmakers, leaders in this country have a special responsibility to hold themselves to a higher standard of civility to the extent that they're making xenophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, homophobic, or sexist remarks. It gives license potentially to bigots to do the same, and at worst could even incite bigots to commit acts of violence against targeted communities. So that was another issue that was raised at the hearing. And there are many, many other issues that were raised by organizations in the context of their written testimony, and it would be, I think, a very good thing for all of us on the call, call the Senate Judiciary Committee and urge them to expedite the publication of the hearing transcript so that we have a sense of all of the issues that were raised and use that as a foundation for doing work going forward. On the next slide, I just want to boil down for you some of the tips and lessons learned in the context of the work that we did after the Oak Creek massacre to put this hearing together. A lot of this stuff may seem obvious and kind of old hats, but I think it's worth underscoring the importance of these common sense principles. In the first place, it's important for any organization working on any issue to develop or build subject matter expertise. Ultimately, all of us can serve as resources, not just to the government, but also to media outlets and also other community organizations. The Anti-Defamation League, for example, is regarded as a subject matter expert on hate crime issues, generally speaking. And government officials, media organizations, and community organizations look to the ADL for guidance and expertise on issues of hate crimes more generally. The organization that I mentioned before, SALT, has developed now subject matter expertise on the issue of xenophobic and particularly like anti-Muslim rhetoric in the post-9/11 environment. And again, stakeholders in government, media, and community groups look to SALT for expertise on those issues. The Sikh community is sort of the source of information for the Sikh Coalition in terms of our advocacy, and so we connect the dots on various issues like hate crime, workplace discrimination, school bullying, racial profiling, vis-a-vis the Sikh community. And so this is a very important point. It's important to be a resource, and to do that you have to build subject matter expertise no matter what issue you're trying to address. How do you build subject matter expertise? Well, one way to do it is to collect evidence about the need to address whatever problem you're trying to address. So, for example, we have conducted a number of community surveys that provide hard evidence to policymakers that there are issues relating to hate crimes and school bullying and others in the Sikh community. And so conducting community surveys at the grassroots level is a very good way not only to build subject matter expertise, but also sort of prove up the fact that there are problems in need of addressing at the government level and so forth. Historical and legal research is very important. I told you that the first documented instances of violence against the Sikh community occurred as far back as 1907. And I think that's a very important advocacy point, because there was, we found, a perception among government officials that violence against Sikhs was simply merely a post-9/11 phenomenon. That's not true at all. Violence against Sikhs and other minorities is a problem that's been with us for many, many generations now, and that suggests that we haven't really done as much work as we perhaps should do to address those problems. So conducting legal and historical research is another important component of building subject matter expertise and making your case that there is a problem that needs to be resolved. Very important to build coalitions within the interfaith community and beyond. Part of the reason why we were able to convince the Senate to organize a hearing after the Oak Creek massacre was because we had support from over 150 organizations representing the interests of tens of millions of Americans. There are probably around 500,000 Sikhs in this country, and although it would have been a strong statement of solidarity for all of the principal Sikh or South Asian or Arab and Muslim American organizations to send a letter to the Senate, it was strategically a very, very important point for us to make, that these were issues of relevance not just to our post-9/11 communities, but to Americans more generally. So there is strength in diversity, and there's strength in numbers in the context of advocacy. It's very important to share expertise with allies and partner organizations. To the extent that we could pool resources and share data with each other, it makes our advocacy points stronger. For example, in the context of school bullying, we have partnered very strongly with the LGBT community and with other post-9/11 communities to pool bullying data so that we can make a stronger case to policymakers about the need to pass more robust laws against bullying and harassment at the federal level. So sharing expertise is an important lesson learned and ought to be a prerequisite for any kind of advocacy, especially in the civil rights and social justice realms. It's important to engage with policymakers proactively and consistently. We didn't approach the Senate Judiciary Committee as sort of an ad hoc response to the Oak Creek massacre. We approached offices with whom we had been building relationships for several months and years. And so as subject matter experts, organizations can provide information and updates on an ongoing basis to Senate offices, to congressional offices more generally, any government officials, frankly, at the state, local, federal levels, and serve as liaisons to affected communities and so forth, and be in a position then to be able to ask for a hearing once something happens that sort of calls out for the need to address any of the issues that we're working on. So the offices that we worked with to organize this hearing in the U.S. Senate were not offices that we were meeting for the first time. They were offices with whom we had relationships. So as subject matter experts, always engage with policymakers proactively and consistently. Just keep them updated about whatever it is that you work on as far as subject matter goes. It's important, similarly, to build relationships with the media. The media played, I think, an instrumental role in amplifying awareness about what happened in Oak Creek, why it was significant in the larger context of post 9/11 discrimination, and also played an instrumental role in creating appreciation for why this hearing in the Senate was so important and why it was just the beginning of hopefully an ongoing dialogue about the need to address hate crime and bigotry in the United States. So much in the way you can provide subject matter expertise to government officials, you can provide subject matter expertise to the media and just keep issues warm by, say, writing op-eds, letters to the editor, issuing press releases anytime you issue reports, or organize projects, community service projects or otherwise. So very important to stay in touch with media and build relationships with them so that if you have a major ask for them, like, we're having this hearing and you ought to attend and cover it, you already have a pre-existing relationship. Lastly, it's very important to be entrepreneurial and seize opportunities to advance your campaign. This is not a hard and fast rule. I think advocacy is not a science; it's kind of an art, and it's very difficult to come up with a formula that would provide answers as to how one ought to proceed in the context of advocacy. But if you have an opportunity, for example, to write a letter to the editor or publish an op-ed in a way that would create awareness about the problem of hate crimes, for example, you ought to be on the lookout for those opportunities. Over the weekend, for example, I believe CNN.com had published an article about deficiencies in hate crime data collection by the FBI. And they actually mentioned the work that the Sikh Coalition has been doing with respect to the need to improve data collection vis-a-vis Sikhs and others, and some of the work that we've been doing in Congress. If something of that nature had appeared in the context of, say, your local newspaper, that would have been a great opportunity to write a letter to the editor and perhaps add another dimension to that dialogue or to that discussion. So again, many of these points are probably not new points. I think they're fairly commonsensical, but these principles have proven to be very helpful to us at the Sikh Coalition. And the one thing that I will leave you with, which isn't written on the PowerPoint, is the need for persistence. Oftentimes when we pitch media or offer up op-eds and this kind of thing, we are turned down. We're rejected. When we try to elicit support from the U.S. Congress on civil rights issues, sometimes we don't get support, and we're told no, or just ignore it altogether. And so it's important not to sort of lose hope or lose faith anytime we're pursuing these campaigns, especially in the context of such a formidable challenge like bigotry and hate crime. I mean, these are profound challenges, and they're going to be setbacks, but it's all it's sort of important to move forward, keep our heads up, and be persistent and to persevere. And once a good opportunity comes up to create awareness about a particular challenge, or pass a law, for example, that might help address some of these challenges, we have to be on notice to be able to seize those opportunities. And in order to do that, we have to always be consistent, always persevere, and just keep faith that things will turn out all right in the fullness of time. So with that, I will stop and would welcome any questions or comments or feedback you have, and would love to have a very robust discussion with all of you.
Oh, thank you so much, Raj. I think you hit so many excellent points. This is Molly here, the coordinator of Faiths Against Hate. Yes, I agree. It's time for a very robust conversation, and we have significant attendees here who I know have some questions that they definitely want to ask you. I want to open by bringing something up we talked about in our discussion, which was reaching out to at-risk communities through media outreach. And by at-risk communities, we mean maybe populations who aren't exposed to diversity training and might be harboring some of that anger that does manifest into hate crimes. So have you at the Sikh Coalition come up with any strategies to get those messages out to those sort of communities where there are hate groups operating?
Sure. So, we have a pretty broad network of volunteers around the country. The Sikh Coalition a couple years ago launched an advocacy training program called the Sikh Advocate Academy, where we bring community volunteers from around the country to Washington, D.C. and cross-train them on the same advocacy methods that we use every day, full-time, in the course of doing our work. And I don't want to suggest that there are any states or cities in this country where, people are more susceptible or liable to commit hate crimes and this kind of thing. But proactively, what we've encouraged our volunteers all over the country to do is write op-eds for their local newspapers, invite media outlets, local TV, newspapers, and so forth, to Sikh Gurdwaras, places of worship, to just be a part of the community and see that Sikhs are vibrant and integral part of those communities, and have an appreciation for Sikh traditions that are consistent with the highest ideals of America. For example, we've encouraged many of our volunteers around the country to invite the media to Sikh Gurdwaras to learn about the institution of langar. Langar is an over 5 centuries old tradition in the Sikh religion, which has been with us from the inception of the Sikh faith, where Gurdwaras, places of worship, organize free community kitchens and serve free meals to all visitors, Sikh or non-Sikh, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if, for example, a newspaper in Mississippi, Tennessee, or California, or New York, where there isn't particularly a strong Sikh population, were to go to a Sikh Gurdwara and write a story about the langar tradition and the Sikh faith, that might proactively give people a positive sort of image or perception of Sikhs, and a greater appreciation of the contributions that Sikhs make to their communities. And so, yes, we do try always proactively to promote awareness about Sikhs through the media, through our community volunteers. And I think that's low-hanging fruit. Anybody could write an op-ed. Newspapers, particularly community newspapers in small towns, are always hungry for content, and they're looking for new angles and new stories to cover for their newspapers. And interfaith work generally, particularly in the context of community service, is always something that, in our experience, media is interested in covering in this country. So yes, it is an important part of our advocacy.
Yeah, I do some media monitoring here at the Council for Parliament of World Religions because I also handle our newsletter. And recently I read a story that came out of California that was about an interfaith coalition led by 6th graders who are visiting mosques and writing into the media and doing the kind of work we're trying to do at a very young age. And I'm seeing more and more of those stories. So I think it is very hopeful. What I do want to get to now is a question from Eileen Epperson, who is an ambassador of the Council for Parliament of the World's Religions. She's on the Advisory Council. I'm going to go to Eileen and ask, would you like to share your questions and comments?
Yes. Yes, I would. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Oh, isn't that great? Yay for technology. That's great. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This is an extraordinary conversation and very helpful, and I've sent about 5 remarks now, but just one question. It does seem to me that that Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus may not be targeted for their religion. That may be too sophisticated an understanding. It seems more primal than that it's because of how they look, and that they look like the bad guys. And if that is true, does that illuminate or cloud the issue because of something as basic as almost primitive as appearance rather than religion? And nobody's going to change their appearance. So what do you think about that, first of all, Rajdeep?
Well, thanks so much for your comment. I think it's a good point, and it is true that the prevailing stereotype in the post-9/11 environment is that if somebody wears a turban, they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and it may be as primal or as unsophisticated as that. And in general, though, we're not so focused on kind of educating bigots. I mean, some people are beyond redemption. I think the key is to sort of create awareness and appreciation for diversity generally among the overwhelming majority of Americans, and in any society this would be the case, who are on our side. And I think one of the ways that the Sikh community certainly can get ahead in this regard is to create positive stereotypes about Sikhs. As many of you know, in the last couple of weeks, there was a Sikh contestant on American Idol who I believe was a semi-finalist, as I recall. And that's great. I mean, that is, arguably more powerful advocacy than what, I do for a living. I mean, policy wonky stuff doesn't reach the masses. But if you have a Sikh, playing an acoustic guitar, singing, Georgia on the Mind to tens of millions of Americans, it gives people a sense that Sikhs are an integral part of this country, and that the way we look is a source of diversity, and that diversity is a source of strength for this country. So I do agree that a lot of this does come down to stereotyping and negative associations that have been perpetuated by the media vis-a-vis turbans and beards, for example. But these can be counteracted by creation of positive stereotypes through the arts and other media.
Yeah, very good. I got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to move now to, if you're around, Suzanne Morgan, who is our Ambassador of Sacred Spaces at the Council for Parliament of World Religions, and is also the seed fundraiser for this important work we're doing through the Faith Against Hate campaign, and to which we're incredibly indebted. I'm very interested in you sharing your questions, Suzanne. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And Suzanne, I'd like to share with you that we have a Sikh artist who stopped into the office to participate in the webinar, whose chief work is painting sacred spaces.
Wow, fantastic. Is he still there?
He's still here. His name is Saeed Idris, and he's sitting in with us, and I think you two should meet.
Sounds great. Maybe later today.
Sure. So your question talked about the desired results of these efforts. Would you like to elaborate?
Sure. I'd like to know what kinds of policies are desired to decrease hate.
What kinds of policies are needed to decrease hate?
Right.
Well, there's several. It's really sort of an all-hands-on-deck approach that we're pursuing. The easiest place and probably the most efficient place to start is are the public schools. And the Sikh Coalition and a number of organizations, both within and outside the Interfaith community, have been promoting legislation at the federal level called the Safe Schools Improvement Act. It would be the first federal anti-bullying legislation. And similar efforts can be undertaken at the state and local levels. You can go to your local school districts and school boards and state governments and so forth and ask them to strengthen their anti-bullying laws. Beyond that, we go into public schools, and other organizations have been doing this for a long, long time, but try to create appreciation for diversity and cultural awareness and so forth in the public schools. And the idea there is to inoculate young people, children, against stereotypes and bigotry of the sort that could manifest itself later in life as workplace discrimination, racial profiling, and so forth. So it's very important to start with the schools. And beyond that, and this is probably beyond the scope of one webinar, we're actively trying to promote laws that promote religious freedom in the workplace. Many of you may be surprised to know this, but there are loopholes in federal law that allow employers to segregate visibly religious employees, like Sikhs, like Muslims, like observant Jews, from the public in the name of corporate image. Effectively, it's a modern-day version of the separate but equal doctrine. So having more visibility in the workplace for religious minorities is a way to decrease or combat hate. And beyond that, we need to be very supportive of efforts to end racial profiling and religious profiling in this country. There's legislation that's just on the verge, I think, of being introduced in the U.S. Congress called the End Racial Profiling Act. And it would be the first sort of federal prohibition on racial and other forms of profiling in the United States, which, as you know, is a problem that has been affecting many communities, particularly African American and Latino communities, for decades now. So if you have more sensitivity and appreciation with respect to diversity in this country, in all aspects of life, our schools, our workplaces, the way in which the law enforcement agencies interact with the public, if you hold politicians accountable and urge them to refrain from making bigoted remarks against any targeted community, I think you may not completely eliminate the risk of hate crime, but you could certainly mitigate the risk and reduce the risk that these things will happen.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to move now to someone I've had the pleasure of meeting here in the Parliament office. Anya Cordell, are you with us? Anya? Oh, I think we've lost Anya. She shared a couple of questions. I'm going to see if I can find them, or hopefully that she'll be able to rejoin us. Can you hear me, Raj?
Yes, I can.
Super. Okay, so while I ask for some more participation, because I know there are a lot of questions that would be great to direct to you, I'll ask, when you talk about holding politicians accountable for bigoted speech and rhetoric, are you talking about there being any kind of penalty or consequence? Is that a reason that you would suggest that someone may be impeached or just exposed in a public way, say in the media? What would be a good approach for combating that xenophobia, that rhetoric?
Well, definitely the latter. As you know, one of the strongest protections that all of us enjoy in this country is the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And, you know, one of the bullets we have to bite, so to speak, is that you have to tolerate obnoxious and hateful speech. There's a difference between hateful speech and acts of violence. So, you know, you don't want to restrict people's freedom of expression and freedom of thought and so forth. But at the same time, what you could do is you could use levers like media to hold politicians accountable anytime they do make bigoted remarks. And an organization that I mentioned on this call earlier, SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, issued a very, very good report a couple years back documenting on a bipartisan basis, by the way, some of the obnoxious things that candidates for office and sitting members of Congress and other state and local officials have said over the years. And so, you know, I'm sure politicians have a stake in their reputations, and if somebody has a reputation for being a bigot, I can't imagine that being an asset for them politically. And so members of the public can call out politicians, write letters to the editor anytime they say things which are obnoxious or bigoted. And I should not use the word obnoxious. I think that seems like a lower standard of culpability, so to speak. I mean, if somebody says something that's obviously homophobic or sexist or bigoted and targeted at particular communities, for example, I mean, there have been politicians who, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, who used epithets like towel heads, ragheads to describe Arabs, Muslims, Sikhs, and South Asians. I mean, that kind of language is inappropriate. And so, fortunately, those politicians were called out and had to pay the price for the things that they said. So, using media as a lever to hold people accountable and persuading politicians to hold themselves accountable and hold each other accountable is important. They ought to understand that you can't just appeal to the lowest common denominator in this country and not expect to be called out by your constituents, by the media, and also by your fellow policymakers.
Oh, that's really good insight. I am hoping to be able to maybe perform that in some of my advocacy, sort of spotlight some of the xenophobic rhetoric I've been reading. I'm going to move to another person who is submitted a question, Neha Singh. Neha, are you there? Neha? Did you have a question you wanted to share? Oh, she's muted herself. So I'm hoping to share some more questions. I see Anya has returned. Anya, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you. So I missed whatever it was that you said after you mentioned my name.
Oh, I was gonna ask you if you wanted to share your comments because you had sent some comments in.
Well, I wanted to briefly introduce myself and just point people to some of the work that I did. As a non-Sikh, non-Muslim ally, somebody who's Jewish, who worked very hard post 9/11, pre-9/11 as well, but definitely post 9/11, because of the emphasis on writing op-eds, writing letters to the editor, and being a local activist, I think the easiest thing would be just to point people to the website, which is appearanceism.com. That's the word appearance and then a dash ism, ISM.com. And the pieces that I wrote for the Washington Post after Oak Creek were a piece called Sikh Sparing Pizza, which is a strange title, but becomes clear if you read the article. Sikh Sparing Pizza and Grieving in a Sea of Sikhs. And then a much bigger overview of the whole thrust of my work as somebody who became so passionate from outside of the communities who were at this point being most targeted, a piece called Where the Anti-Muslim Path Leads. And all of those can be linked to through that website, as well as the video of one prototype of a program that I do where I introduce people to Balbir Sodi and to the other victims post 9/11, innocent men who were murdered in the days and weeks, and of course, as we know now, sadly, years following 9/11, who were, Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, South Asian, perfectly innocent people, and also just if you poke around further into that, seeking initiatives and strategies that people, not just in interfaith coalitions and not just people who are connected to faith communities, but how regular, people, if they are or aren't connected to such communities, can actually be active and do something that has some impact.
Thank you, Anya. I think you're absolutely correct, and I can vouch. I've read some of Anya's writing, and Where the Anti-Muslim Path Leads was really, really beautiful and very, very informative for me. So I would definitely recommend that, and I welcome anybody to write to me after the webinar or call into the Parliament office if they have any more direct questions that they want to ask me. Molly, MOLLY, @parliamentofreligions.org is my email address. and I'd be happy to share some of those articles with you if you'd like to read them. I'm going to thank Anya, and I'm going to just read out the question that Neha Singh sent for you, Raj. She's looking for ideas on how to get more Sikh college students involved in interfaith work on campuses in particular.
Well, as many of you may be aware, there already are many sort of interfaith organizations and faith-specific organizations on college campuses. There are Sikh and Muslim and Sikh, Hindu and Jewish student associations and college campuses nationwide. And maybe one idea is to have sort of an umbrella organization set up that links all these organizations together. One other sort of point to note is that there often is at the college collegiate level turnover. So what will happen is you may have a particular organization which is very strong and very active, but then everybody graduates and there isn't really a succession plan. So it might be worth looking into succession planning and creating structures and mechanisms that allow student organizations in the interfaith space to have and continuity of focus.
You know, I see, Neha, are you with us? She's got her hand raised. Thought she might wanted to participate. No, that's very practical, and I also want to bring to light the fact that the White House has an office of faith-based coalitions, and they've been doing an interfaith community service campus challenge now for the last few years, where they have actually inspired now nearly 300 campuses to organize interfaith work on campus. So there is a very strong push to get people involved, and I think a key thing is getting people involved before college so that they come in prepared to do work at a more adult level when they get to college. From the public school perspective you were talking about earlier. I'm going to just ask people if they have any questions that they want to share. Our participants, we're going to be going on for another couple of minutes, so I might have time for one or two more questions. But just to keep things rolling, I have a couple of more questions for you, Raj. When you talk about, earlier you were mentioning the needs assessment survey that you could do in your community that would strengthen your case when you approach a media organization or a government organization. Can you give me a little bit more detail about what you mean by that and how that's done?
Sure. So for many, many decades, for as long as Sikhs have been in this country, anecdotally, we've known of people who have been subjected to workplace discrimination, school bullying, racial, religious profiling, and hate crimes. But you can't go to a policymaker's office and say, look, anecdotally speaking, we know that these are issues in our communities. You need hard data. You need to give them a sense of how widespread the problem is. And so with that in mind, we conducted needs assessment surveys in New York City, San Francisco Bay Area, surveyed thousands of Sikhs, adults and children in those cities, and we're able to come up with some hard figures, which suggest that in the context of hate crime, for example, Sikhs are potentially hundreds of times more likely than their fellow Americans to experience hate crimes. And the same can be said, by the way, of school bullying and workplace discrimination. So, you know, having hard data gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problems that you're trying to address. And this actually served us well in both New York City and California in recent years. For example, in New York City, we conducted surveys and found that a majority of turban-wearing Sikh kids are bullied at school. And we also found that there wasn't, prior to, say, like 2008, 2009, a very robust set of anti-bullying laws. So what we did was, on the basis of our survey data, partnered with other organizations, including the LGBT community, and lobbied the City of New York to pass a chancellor's regulation, which is like a city law or regulation, that for the first time provides anti-bullying protections to all public school students, all however many million students there are in New York City. And that was something that was based on survey work that we did at the grassroots level in New York City. In California, in 2010, we released a similar survey and found that 12% of Sikhs in the San Francisco Bay Area had experienced workplace discrimination because of their religion. And so on the strength of those data, lobbied the state of California through the Assembly and the Senate there, in partnership with something like 18 interfaith organizations, to pass something called AB 1964, which is Workplace Religious Freedom Act, and it strengthens protections for people who need religious accommodations in the workplace. It prohibits workplace segregation, which is something that I mentioned earlier in the call, and provides workers in California with the strongest protections against religious discrimination in the workplace anywhere in the country. But again, it started at Gurdwaras and Khalsa schools, which are, where we in the Gurdwaras teach children about Sikh history and culture and religion and so forth. I mean, the survey data is where it all got started, and it sort of evolved into a proper organized campaign to pass what is now pretty substantial civil rights legislation. So I cannot overstate the importance of conducting data, building a case for the need for particular civil rights laws, and partnering with other organizations to make sure that these goals are fully realized.
Oh, yes. I think you've just made California a very attractive place for people to want to live and work with the work that you've done there. I'm going to go to our last question, and I'm going to thank everyone who has asked questions and those who have been listening in. I look forward to your feedback, and I know Raj probably will as well. Like to hear your thoughts afterwards. And I'm going to thank everyone profusely for participating in our Face Against Hate campaign, and be on the lookout for emails in the future, in the next few weeks, on our coming webinars. And our last question is from John Lamond. John, are you with us?
I'm here.
Thank you. I read your question. I would love for you to share it with everyone.
Well, the question I asked is, it would seem natural for all religious organizations to come together to combat hate, but have you found resistance to cooperation by some religious groups?
Well, I have not. There may be issues where it's difficult for organizations to coalesce around 100% of the time, and so there are still on the margins some kind of how should I say, there are disagreements about issues like gay marriage, LGBT rights, and this sort of thing, which need to be dealt with. But with respect to even those issues, I think we have more in common than we don't. And so it's just important to keep the dialogue open and to keep open hearts and minds, and see whether we can collaborate on issues where there is concurrence, and use that as a foundation to tackle issues where there isn't agreement at this time. The importance is just to have open, full, honest, transparent dialogue with each other, and I think a good place to start is to have interfaith organizations collaborate on community service projects at the grassroots level, at the level of federal policy, collaborate on efforts to protect all of our children against bullying. Certainly that's something that all of us can agree on. And depending on the strength of those collaborations, we may be in a stronger position to tie up loose ends and find common ground on other issues that need to be addressed in the social justice space.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think it's, no, I'm thinking of where I come from in Florida, and I'm living in Hong Kong now, but in Florida, I know the community there, and I think it seems a little bit optimistic sometimes to think that that everyone would, especially among the Christian community, would sort of step up and cooperate in something like this, and trying to stop hate crimes and trying to, increase people's understanding of other religions, because certain religious groups see this as a threat to their own predominance.
Well, our experience has been that the overwhelming, perhaps silent majority of people across the spectrum are sympathetic and supportive of the issues that we work on. And I think it's just a matter of getting acquainted with your neighbor and with your classmate and with your coworker. It's awfully hard to hate somebody you know and understand. There will always be bigots in the world and in our society, but I think overall people are decent and certainly open to having dialogue and developing relationships with people. And our experience has been overwhelmingly positive with people from all across the faith spectrum. And as for optimism, I'll leave you with this thought. In the Sikh religion, there's this sort of religious principle which we're encouraged to incorporate into our lives. It's summed up in the phrase Chardi Kala. Chardi Kala means eternal optimism, eternal high spirits. Sikhs are religiously required to have eternal high spirits, be in a state of Chardi Kala, no matter how difficult their lives are, and no matter what obstacles are thrown in their way. And so, you know, for what it's worth, I think it's always important to keep hope alive, keep faith alive, and remain eternally optimistic that we will make progress in this society and around the world in addressing all the issues that we face.
Excellent advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. I'm going to have to adopt that eternal optimism in our work here, which I hold on to all the time, but your presentation today has definitely given me a booster and some excellent ideas, and I want to thank you for this training. I think it's been extremely helpful across sectors for people working in faith, for people working in social justice, and especially people who are interested in advancing these ideas in schools especially. I want to thank you so very much. And I'm going to bid adieu to everyone, and I'm going to ask, do you have any closing things to say?
No, I would encourage anyone who is interested in the work of the Sikh Coalition to visit our website, worldwideweb.sikhcoalition.org. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, so you should follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And if you have any feedback, critical or otherwise, about this presentation, I would love to hear it, and I'd love to stay in touch with anybody and everybody who is on this call. And I'd just like to end where I began by thanking Molly and the Council for giving me this opportunity. It's really an honor to be a part of this, and look forward to working with you again in the fullness of time.
Oh, I second that. I've been so happy to work with you, and your expertise has just been riveting. And I'm going to thank everyone, and I look forward to keeping in touch. And I want to share that this webinar will be available through the Parliament website, www.parliamentofreligions.org, within the next day or two, and we will be sharing it on our social channels. So please do like and follow through Facebook and Twitter, and keep in touch, and we will be in touch with our next webinar. And I want to thank everyone again for participating and wish them a great day and good luck combating these issues, and keep us in the know what you've been doing and keep us updated. Thank you so much.